Thembisa Fakude is a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. He joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. Thembisa, very good evening to you. So the General Assembly takes into account the candidate states' contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights, as well as their voluntary pledges and commitments in this regard before being elected onto this position. What contribution has South Africa itself made to this point?
Well, South Africa has always been key in this regard since the time of President Nelson Mandela. It has continued to support the people of Palestine, continued to support the lifting of sanctions against Cuba and people of Western Sahara. So in that regard, it's been respected and it has shown resolve. However, I think when it comes to contemporary matters, South Africa will struggle to maintain a position, particularly when it comes to the current challenges that are faced by Iran, the ongoing problems in Ukraine. South Africa will find itself having to make a decision against its allies, including making certain decisions against China that continues to be accused of oppressing the people in Xinjiang.
And I'm just thinking about how, just going through its own credentials, South Africa has just spoken about some of the things that it's done, and particularly weighing in on the non-aligned movement that it's been a part of. And as you said, it's been at odds with some developed countries on the stance that it's taken on Ukraine-Russia conflict. You heard the minister there talk about the need for moral correctitude to ensure that, for instance, some issues are equitably dealt with when we look at the issue of hunger. So just helping us understand where to draw the line. So with membership on the council, it comes with a responsibility to uphold high human rights standards. But who's to say which ones are the best in line with your own diplomatic national values and principles, but what you see as a need for the current world order?
Well, in 2018, South Africa had a big challenge when it had to vote against the resolution on Yemen, and it had to abstain because it had certain deals with Saudi Arabia. So there is a prevailing common sense when it comes to the suppression of rights and human rights around the world, including what Bashar al-Assad, for example, did to his people from 2011. South Africa has been at pains in terms of condemning Bashar al-Assad, for example. So it's becoming very difficult as South Africa continues to establish serious alliances with various countries, and it's also part of these blocs, including BRICS and IPSA, that it will condemn its own colleagues within these blocs. So I'm not quite sure whether, in fact, henceforth is actually a prudent thing to even push to join platforms such as United Nations Security Council and this particular council, because we end up taking a fence or sitting on a fence in this regard because we're afraid of offending certain people, or we're trying very hard to push for peaceful position. And this has been a posture, not only in South Africa, but particularly of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is a known negotiator and a peacemaker, a person who doesn't offend anyone.
So then let's kind of work back and work through the role of South Africa in the evolution of international human rights and humanitarian law norms and standards. It does say it believes that it's played quite a influential role. You mentioned some of the issues that have got us into hot water. I recall the presence of then Sudanese President Hassan Omar al-Bashir in South Africa for an African Union summit, that causing an uproar, and how South Africa behaved on that. So what then governs what, particularly the vision it has for Africa in these contemporary times, and what the West has been accused of, just also not being a fair player, siding with the developed countries at the expense of developing countries?
I think in the past it has been easy because of the active civil society. Civil society in South Africa was extremely active in terms of highlighting all the various struggles around the world. And therefore, it made it very easy for South African government to take certain position because it basically was following what has been amplified by the civil society. But now that the civil society in South Africa has become much more quieter, you find the South African government having to take certain position independently. And that is creating problems. And when we see, for example, what's happening with Western Sahara, the ANC not long ago to the UN buildings in support of the people of Western Sahara. Cubans continue to enjoy a very strong support in South Africa, including the Palestinians. So it's therefore easy for South African government to take position. But there are other positions that are not necessarily amplified by the civil society. Therefore, you find the government having to take either it abstains or it sits on the fence in this regard. But again, I don't think the South African civil society or government has always been against the developed world, which, by the way, has always been a culprit in this regard. But South Africa has always been known to be taking very strong position on human rights. But since, as I've said, the collapse of the civil society or the quietening of the civil society, the South African government has found itself in a much more tougher position because it can't use that justification to the world and to all other concerned that the South African civil society is calling for certain changes or suppression or changes in certain rights. And as a result, it's becoming very, very difficult for Naledi Pandor and the government to take very strong positions on human rights.
I'm just recalling how in 2001, South Africa hosted the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance on behalf of Africa. Given what some have said is our track record on some of these issues, that we have built our accolades on, the criticism that we face. So South Africa has been very clear on that some of the issues that are exaggerated, but some have said that we're being too academic on the face of what they see as their citizens facing discrimination. From a diplomatic point of view, how do you straddle these lines? And given our experiences, what contribution then can South Africa make at the Council?
Well, South Africa has made quite a lot of contribution in this regard. But as I've said alone, and this is very important, without a strong civil society, as a maturing democracy, we now face with a situation where we have to take independent position as government. In the past, we had support of the civil society. So the foreign policy was, to a large extent, driven by civil society preferences and struggles. Then now that the civil society is no longer there, South Africa has to take positions, but they've taken very strong positions. As I've said, on Palestine, they've taken positions on Cuba. They continue to advocate, for example, of the lifting of sanctions of Zimbabwe and other causes around the world. But the contemporary challenges, particularly on Iran, which is facing continual process, China and Russia, I think South Africa will find itself in a position where it will be found wanting on what position to take, because all of these countries are strong allies of South Africa, and South Africa wouldn't want to be seen to be offending these countries.